This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is episode 84.
I know a woman who literally purchased a bar in downtown DC because she was concerned about the lack of third spaces in her community, her neighborhood. And she's trying to run it that way. And so it's not so much what's the space as who are the people that are going to make this happen.
That's how I found out about our guest today. When I heard this, I knew I needed to speak to that person. Scarry spent 7 years working in traditional, overtly bridge-building spaces. She eventually left that formal work to imagine how to create lower barriers to entry for folks to experience meaningful relationships in the places they already go naturally. Now she is living out the answer to that curiosity as a bar owner in Washington, D.C. Let's get right into it. So I wanted to kind of start with, in this bridge building space, and I think we even talked about this a little bit, that some of these efforts kind of attract, I think you called it sort of the usual suspects, sort of people already motivated to do this work. And so, sort of, is that where the idea of a bar came in? I mean, is there something about a bar or a coffee shop that maybe can do something that these formal civic or institutional spaces can't do?
I think that's my question that I'm trying to live the answer to. I had spent 7 years working in a really traditional, focused, overtly bridge building space. And noticed the usual suspects, had some curiosity about the way I frame it is what's the backdoor entry to some of the most important conversations of our time, especially around some of the issues that I think many people would love if they were able to embody them, but don't know how to articulate it or the language that we've used culturally around some of the bridge building work or just relational work in general has become laden with baggage. And so, I left that work formally to try and imagine into how might we create a lower barrier to entry for folks to experience the kind of relationships that are possible in spaces that they're already going to. I would say it's both about not engaging the usual suspects, for sure. It's also about decompartmentalizing the work to me. That I also found that some of the work I was doing that I loved, but also it was hard for people to bridge it from the seminar, the experience, the dinner into embodying it beyond kind of the designated spaces where this is where we bridge. The organization I worked for did a really, really good job of that. But that was some of my curiosity too, and going out on my own was how actually do we decompartmentalize the work of civic engagement, of relationship building across lines of identity or ideological difference to exist in the places people go really naturally.
Mm-hmm. Something that I think about, in this, I'm curious about how that's going so far, how that's working. But I've been witness to these things falling apart pretty fast, like how rapidly a conversation can degenerate. And out in the wild, I think about that. And then, but because I've even seen it among people that are sort of trained or have some experience or have studied this, kind of thing. It's how quickly, including myself, we can be sort of caught up in it. I'm now reacting. Like I'm not actually doing the things I talk about all the time and I've trained for and all these things. I've lost it. I'm now reacting. So I'm curious, how do you, are you fearful about that? Are you concerned about that? We're doing this out in the wild?
It's a great question. My husband will actually, he's too nice to tell you this, but what I will tell you is that my problem is in a moment where there's heat or conflict that I've gotten reactive, I'm quick to be like, but I do this work, so it must be you that's the problem. So that's my work to sort out. Yeah, I mean, I think so much of what I find myself trying to embody individually and to offer in our space is it's going to be clunky and we don't have to panic about it. I think there's so many moments we get caught taken out of a moment of conflict or reactivity by suddenly being like meta reacting to the fact that there's conflict or that there's reactivity instead of normalizing that part of our being in relationship is going to be clunky. And so I try to really offer a space or even a presence for myself and for others that is, oh yeah, that's happening again, where we don't know exactly how to move through that. We don't have to panic about it, but we can acknowledge it and then make some deliberate decisions about how we want to move through it. I think in a bar space, that looks like a lot of different things. It's hard for me to figure out the line about not being really, I don't want to be heavy-handed around, hey, want to have a conversation about democracy? And I also own a bar in Washington, D.C. So, I take seriously how people see me as the bar owner interact with National Guard who come in to use our restroom, or how I navigate when the presence of National Guard means that immigrants in our community feel unsafe, even though National Guard is not in DC right now going after immigrants. Like there still is a signal of their presence that makes folks feel uneasy. How do you do the tension around belonging in a space when you want to welcome everyone and not some people's presence makes other people feel unwelcome? And so, I think about it in that way, all the way down to like, how do we engage customer feedback if they don't like a beverage they've gotten? I even think that is the opportunity to practice. I can't read your mind and I want you to have a good experience and you're giving me feedback isn't personal. It's helping me give you the experience I want you to have. Even little moments like that feel like it's building us the musculature to be more honest, to be more deliberate, to kind of live into the nuances that I think they exist already in many of our public spaces. I just think we don't culturally have the tools to know how to move through them. And I find myself overwhelmed, energized, exhilarated by the chance to practice it in my own particular context. Yeah, I think it's so much about listening, taking people seriously, humanizing people, understanding what they're saying, and also there's so many layers of this skill. Like there are also moments that I know I'm someone's target because they just had a hellacious day and I'm a really easy place for them to swing. And not me, but like the experience of getting the wrong beverage when everything else has gone wrong in their day. How frequently does that translate? I'm thinking a lot about, I'm in a text thread right now with a group of folks who are responding to ICE in our own town. And, we're recording this the day after the shooting in Minnesota. And it was so interesting to watch people process where we go from here. And how do you know, like, how much of that is just grief, rage coming out in the way that it does, that just needs some space? How much of it is a course correct? I think that's also a piece of it is the skill to know that, the iceberg analogy, like all the other things we bring into every single conversation we're having that aren't actually about the moment itself, but are about all the things that moment allowed us to surface, and I think that is also something you can more easily see in a customer service space. Like, oh, they're just having a bad day. That's really hard when you're in a kind of gridlocked in a personal or highly charged political conversation.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and that brings up another thing that, everyone in sort of the bridge building space in one way or another has to always kind of negotiate this advocacy versus, sort of neutrality kind of idea, right? And being keeping your reputation and your of being a bridge builder, but still like we still have things we care about, right? And how do we draw that line about advocacy? So how do you do that with the bar? Like, does it take, do you host advocates and do you I don't know, protests or, that kind of thing, or organizing? I mean, how do you, that's another tightrope you kind of have to walk.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a common misconception in the bridge building world is that we're finding common ground. I actually don't. I think common humanity feels like a different aim. And I think that although I too fall into the trap of things would be better if everyone thought like me, at my best in deep relationship with people, I realize how much I need other people's perspectives and the perspectives that I think there's no way we're going to align. I usually, if I can suspend my own impulses, I usually can learn something or sharpen my own perspective by being in those relationships. I think the other thing that's true is I am a white American citizen who is cisgendered, heterosexual, like I don't embody a lot of the identities that are at threat right now. And so I take that really seriously, that means I can have some kinds of conversations with folks that not everybody is safe to. That feels really, it makes me feel a great sense of responsibility. Um, yeah, so a couple more practical things around, who are we welcoming? How are we doing that? I don't think people wonder where I stand. We've done a few things like pop-up chaplaincy, like non-religious chaplaincy hours for federal workers, for folks who are kind of on the front lines of protests. We've done some things like that. We have offered our space pretty regularly to folks who are protesting right now. We try to be yes people in our space for community groups that are organizing, that are trying to take good care of their neighbors. Certainly it comes up, like there's a question, certainly even amongst our team, of should we be letting the National Guard use the restroom in our space? What's the impact of that? And right now, my answer is yes, and let's engage them when they're in the building, But I don't feel like the bridge building work requires me to tone down the advocate part of me, or the part of me that has like very strong opinions. I think it requires me to sometimes do the work of saying, this is where I land, and that doesn't mean I don't have space for where you land, even if it's in a completely opposite space. I feel like that is the bridge I'm often making, of just because we aren't completely misaligned here doesn't mean I don't have room to hear you, to honor the dignity in you, and to take your perspective really seriously.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I heard you speak about the idea of helping, ordinary people learn how to ask questions better. And I'm curious about that. I mean, how do you go about that, and how's it working?
Yeah. So I have two ways I'm thinking about that. One is, how do we teach our team? How do we kind of, model it? I don't think I'm the most heavy-handed around, this is what I want you to ask, or how I want you to, show up. And we do try to cultivate a team of people who also really know how to take care of our guests well. I think some of that is curiosity, is listening. And so we feedback that a lot with our team. We're about to launch we're playing with a couple possibilities, but we're about to launch having like a conversation starter at every table. We're thinking out either rotating it every week, or having, a set that people can pick from. I think a lot of it is taking the vulnerability off other people so they can try something. So it's really different to try and start a kind of deep conversation with a friend. There's a vulnerability to that is not the same as, I'm asking you the question that's on the card on our table. Suddenly I'm the one who takes on your vulnerability, if you will. They can point to, I'm not doing this because I'm putting myself on the line. I'm doing this because I was prompted to. And that kind of lowers a barrier to entry to people to have a different kind of connection. I think about questions like, what do you wish other people knew about what it's like to be you? Or, things like that, what's something that if you had 5 minutes uninterrupted to talk about whatever's on your mind, what's something you wish you had the space to share? And let me give you those 5 minutes. So we're thinking about giving folks things like that, either them existing on our menu, on tables, so that we can, again, let folks either opt in or not to the kinds of conversations we hope to happen in our space.
Yeah, there are always sort of limits to this work, and we have to be realistic. I think a lot of people accuse many of us working in the space of being just naive. You just expect people to get along all the time, or whatever other reason being naive. So it's kind of another, I guess I keep talking about tightropes, but it's kind of another one we have to walk, is accepting our limits. Like we know it's not always going to work, that kind of thing. So maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm having two reactions to what you said. One is, definitely around accepting my own limits. One certainly is around the misconception that this is the work of just getting along. I do think that's a piece of this. I did a dialogue a couple years ago for a university talking about Israel-Palestine. And I feel like my whole role as the facilitator in that conversation was to say, it's going to be clunky, and that's evidence that we're trying. It's not evidence that we're failing. And I think that again, people react so much to why can't we just get along, or why are we fighting, or why is there conflict? And they experience it as failure. And I think to be a non-anxious, steady presence in the face of something that feels really heated, and to say, this is just part of it, is really important, a really important piece of this work. I feel that in sharing a bar space, we share with the theater, and then we share with a coffee shop as well. The coffee shop operates in the morning behind the bar. Then there's a couple hours where no one's operating, and we operate behind the same space in the evening. That has plenty of opportunity in the bar space to talk about what it is. Even with guests, they ask questions about what's it like to share a space? And I can say things like, well, every relationship requires concessions, but and our negotiations about what are the things we're willing to relinquish in order to do something together. And that's just part of it. And that is, we believe that working in this space together is something better than we could have done in a space where we had free reign on our own. And so that, there's opportunity all the time to dialogue with folks about this if we are just deliberate about how we're storytelling about being in that space. I think for my own limits, some of it is, it's funny that I want to self-reflect about this a little bit more after this conversation. I think about it as we are a piece in the constellation of what's needed to heal our country right now. We do need people who are harder lines about who is and isn't welcome, or harder lines about what is and isn't acceptable. We need people who are agitators. We need people who are on the front lines of protests, I think. I feel like we're a space that can really catch people. It can be a processing space, and the limits to that are, in order to do it, there are times that I don't push somebody beyond where they're able to go, even if I want them to get further than they are, I also think a lot about playing a long game, so if we have regulars who watch me interact with the National Guard every week for a year, that's a totally different experience than let's sit down for an hour and talk about the National Guard. And so I try to trust in a long game in that way, Also, just being a human in the world in this moment, there are plenty of days I show up to the bar unwilling to engage, exhausted, overwhelmed, annoyed. And I try to also play a long game that way. So, I had that experience this week where I saw one of our regulars who, the last time I saw him, I was just in no good shape. And it felt important to own that, to say, I'm so glad to see you. Last time you were here, I was in some sort of way. And I want to just own that. And I didn't have the chance. I wasn't able to engage with you then, but I am wondering how you are. That feels also like it normalizes what it is to be fumbling through this moment together.
Well, and that makes me also think about how you kind of protect yourself. Like, what are your limits or guardrails so that you don't become emotionally overwhelmed?
Mm. Yeah, so I'm a chaplain by trade. So I do feel like I had to learn to not take it all on. Like I do feel like I have built the musculature on what is and isn't mine to own. I have my own, I'm a daily journaler. I try to have spaces where I can put on a page everything I'm feeling, thinking, experiencing. I try to stay in good touch with myself, and I see a counselor every week. I feel like I also have a good community of people. One of the gifts of having done this work professionally is I have a dear group of people who also know what it is to live and breathe this work, even if their setting is different. And they're really my lifeline, to talk through the moments that I've messed it up, or to talk through the moments that it feels impossible or that I don't have hope in it. All of those really normal parts of, again, fumbling through this moment. I think those are things that keep me steady. I also am a person who has a little bit of an optimistic view. I have a lot of belief in possibility, in the power of people connecting, and I also have a big bias towards action. So the being in it and the attempt fuels me more than it drains me, and so that helps for sure.
Well, that's awesome. Yeah, like you said, I think, and it's important to note that all of us doing this work are like one part of this larger. I think like the Guy and Heidi Burgess call it like this massively parallel work going on. And I think we have to keep that in perspective. No one of us is going to sort of magically solve all these problems. And maybe that ties in a little bit to this question, which is I was going to ask you, with your real world experience here and doing this in real communities, have you come to see some, I don't know, some perspective or maybe a misconception about this work that you wish you could just get everybody to let go of?
It's a great question. I feel like there's a lot of them. I mean, I do think that can't we all just get along? I also think that really runs rampant in the field. I think that, and I do sometimes wish the bridging field had a little bit more of a willingness to own their piece of the mess, as my colleague Maya would say. Um, I think there's been a lot of can't we all just get along energy in the bridging world that isn't really the way that relationships work. And I think even as we've moved away from that some in the last couple of years, I do think some of the bridging work fields started from that desire, and we haven't reckoned with what that cost, what that required. Um, I think about the other word that gets thrown around is like pluralism, which also feels like, can't we all just get along? And I don't think that it is that at its core. But I think as much as I try to ask people in conversation and relationship to be accountable to what's theirs to own that they've contributed to the current moment that we're in, I try to do that my own self. And so I think longings for the field, yeah, I wish, and you asked me what I wish we could get rid of misconception wise. And I do think that's the can't we all just get along as the goal here. Or the idea that, I think a lot about at its worst, what the bridging world has done at its worst, and this isn't the only true thing about it, is given people the ability to say, see, I'm not the problem. I've sat down with these people who think differently, who look differently, therefore I'm not really the issue here. Um, and I think that's something we have to reckon with, because I don't think we live in a moment that culturally we're sophisticated in doing our own ownership of the things we contribute to the mess that our country's in right now. And so I both want to dispel the idea that bridging is can't we all get along, and I want the field to be more accountable to owning their piece of the mess.
Yeah, for sure. And at the individual level and also sort of collectively.
Yeah.
Um, so what's a better framing than can't we all just get along?
I'm worried this is going to sound trite, but we need each other. Like communities that are in good relationship are healthier in a number of different ways. We have a loneliness crisis and folks need places they can belong and be seen and where we can be in process to figure out how to be in good relationship with our neighbors and with our own selves. Um, I think being a good neighbor really matters. I think we're in a moment historically where we have a lot of options of who we opt into relationship with. And that's fairly new. You think about religious space many years ago, folks were going to congregations that were proximate to them. And so you had to figure out how to do relational work with people you're going to stay in relationship with. Now it's really easy to kind of have one foot out the door in our relationships at all times. And I think that erosion of being in relationships we can trust and where we are seen and able to be messy with one another has seismic impacts on even public health, on you see studies done on our relationship, our communities that are more relationally connected had a lower like amount of COVID deaths. You see that as have a lower response time to natural disaster. Like I think the frame to me is we need each other and we need to figure out how to be in relationship even and especially when it gets hard and when it's complicated and when we feel like we're at an impasse. And I think we are I read an article this morning about a Minnesota man who every day stands outside his Somali neighbor's door as ICE knocks on her door and is like, I'm here too. I want you to know you're not alone here. Like, we need each other. And I think that doesn't needing one another and knowing our need of one another also counters American hyper-individualism. And I don't think it requires needing to get along in the ways that we think about it, because often that getting along is a really shallow sense of relationship and not the kind of deep relationship that feels steady and secure in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, and that's what I'm glad you went there, because that's what I was going to sort of push on a little bit, or push back on maybe even, is how is that what you're describing not just getting along? And it sounds like when you're talking about, the sort of just get along idea, often it's kind of superficial. It's kind of well, that means we won't talk about hard things.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, we're fine because because we dance around each other. We know what not to say. And I just reject that. I mean, there are certain relationships, of course, that are going to be that way. But to have no close relationships where you can really get into it about and take seriously, I mean, I think that's the other piece, is to take seriously someone else's perspective. I think it's really hard for people to face moral complexity in their own selves and in one another. I think that's a piece of this too. And so I think some of what is happening is we're looking for ways to put ourselves, to make ourselves not morally complicated, And yeah, one of my dearest friends is a Trump voter who still stands by Trump. And that is complicated for me. I don't know if I'm supposed to put my perspective out there, but we've probably already gotten there a little bit in this conversation. It's hard for me to understand. He's my favorite conversation partner, and we go there and like we wrestle it out, and we don't usually, and I have to take his perspective seriously. I always learn something from him. It's not always something that changes my perspective by any means. He's also a person who we've really done life together, and he's one of my safest people because our relationship is not fragile. We don't dance around things. We go there, and he doesn't require me to shift, and I don't totally require him to shift on my best days. Sometimes I wish he would. But I think that can't we all just get along often looks like dancing around, or it looks like fragility of relationships that, um, you know, the other impact of that is I think that the sexiness of a cancel culture is I can jump in because I understand, because I'm trying so hard to make sure I'm not the one who's canceled. That the erosion of relationships that is at any moment I could step on a landmine that makes me outcast from my community. That's cancel culture at its worst. Also, that's not the only story of it. It's at its worst. But I think the fragility of relationships where we can't go there, where it's hard and complicated, means we are walking on eggshells elsewhere. And I don't think that that makes any of us individually feel steady either.
Right, and I think something you mentioned there, and I also want to point out that, I mean, sometimes that's as good as it gets. Like with certain relationships, that dancing around it may be as good as you can have, and that's fine. But it's
totally,
when you can go deeper, you're definitely going to get more value out of that.
When I think everyone needs some relationships where you can go there. I also don't think that means if you are of my political ilk, find your Trump voter friend. I don't actually, that's not what I'm saying either. I think the other thing that is something the field could do differently is to acknowledge diversity in seemingly homogenous groups. The idea that everyone who votes a certain way is aligned. And I often found myself, when I was working in this professionally more overtly, I found people would call me and say, I'm of this identity group or this ideological group. Can you help me find someone who's not to connect with? And actually, I think so often what's required of us is to go deeper with the people right in front of us and to find the places that actually we have a lot of dissonance too. That there's are a monolith. And so how do we actually practice some of these skills with the people with whom we presume we are just aligned?
Yeah, for sure. And I'll say on this, I don't want to harp on this forever, but I'll say it. I know from my personal experience that, these conversations that I have with these people that you might call devil's advocate type conversations or whatever, that give me a new perspective. I have a fairly active, like it may not be the majority of my listeners, but I have a fairly active group that is of listeners that are different from me on my political leanings, and they're the most valuable listeners I have in terms of feedback. Right, those are the ones I feel like I've moved far. I've learned more and grown more from the feedback from that segment, both listeners and also just in my real life, in my regular life outside of the show. Those are the conversations that, in retrospect, like you say, I've grown the most from those relationships and those conversations. And had I not had those and just lived in a bubble all the time, I'm really not growing. I'm not going anywhere.
Yeah. I think so much of it is about taking people's perspective seriously. When it's easy, I think it's really easy to dismiss other people or to sling insults like uneducated or, lack of empathy. And I just can't settle for that. I think I think a lot about I worked as a prison chaplain like 8 years ago.
Oh, we have a whole nother episode.
And I think a lot about, I worked in the mental health unit, and we had this officer who was the most kind, generous person who I watched like wince as he had to put people in solitary confinement. So one day I had the conversation with him. I said, help me understand, like, it's clearly this is not a job you want. And you hear people who say things like, just don't take those jobs. It's a really easy thing to say. Well, he and I get into it, right? And the prison in that community employed had more than half of the jobs in that community. He was caregiving for a parent. And so he was saying, I could get a job in another city. That commute time cuts down on my time to caregive. Like, I can't make my life work that way. When you realize that also we live in a society that's set us up to have to make moral decisions like that. Again, moral complexity in a society that's set up in a certain way. You have to start taking people seriously, So, okay, so what does it mean for me to, in a very imperfect system, I want this person to be healthy as he has to exhibit power over folks who are incarcerated. And I want him to do that in a way that's really healthy and grounded and human. There are limits to that, but I think about that too. You look at, I think about folks. I was saying this the other day. I do a lot of work in some rural communities who are coal mining towns and historically coal mining towns. And as a person who lives in DC, I spent a lot of time earlier this year saying, I get that people want to cut down government spending, but you don't know all the ripple effect of impact of that. And I wish we did it slower, more deliberately. We thought about mitigating kind of the consequences of it. A few years ago, when coal mines were being shut down in some of these other communities, I was pretty loud about, I get that it sucks to lose a job, but it's better for our environment. I was quickly in that camp because I wasn't proximate to it. It's been interesting to now work in coal mining communities who say things a lot like I say about federal government cuts. They say, do you know that coal funded 80% of our social services through the United Way? So when we lost the coal mines, we lost all our social services. Suddenly the opioid epidemic, really took hold of our community. I wish we did this slower. I wish we mitigated the consequences. We are going to be, I have frustration about some of my family members who live in places. I have frustration about friends or family members who don't feel like immigration and the reaction to immigration right now is a crisis in our country. But they live in communities often where there aren't immigrants. And so they're not proximate to it. There are many things I'm not proximate to that therefore I'm not panicking about. And so I want to own that in my own self, and I want to take other people's perspectives seriously, And so actually all they have is fear of people they've never had the chance to know. I can be a person who takes that seriously and who then invites them to consider something different. I hope that's landing or making sense, but I think so much of it is around proximity and taking other people's perspective seriously and acknowledging how much of our perspective is built on what we're proximate to.
Yeah, it's very true. Well, so I wanted to kind of wrap up with if spaces like what you're doing, are working the way you want them to work, what do you think? How would we notice it? Like, how do you think it would show up in our regular lives?
Such an interesting question, because I wrestle a lot with that. What is the impact and how measurable does it have to be? And, you know, I hope that our space is a landing place for people where they can exhale, where they're seen, where they're cared for. I think when people have spaces like that, they show up differently, where you have a place where you, and where you don't have to be on eggshells. I think we do some events that try and kind of, or some of our ways of operating that space try and kind of push people to think differently. Some are come in, settle in, relax, have, something cozy and exhale for a second. I think having places like that you can count on, that you trust, that you know are available to you, hopefully makes you able to show up more steady and grounded in spaces beyond that, So I think success for us looks like people knowing that we'll say yes, or they need a place to gather people. Success for us looks like people leaving our space feeling seen and like they were cared for, or like they were connected to somebody else in the community or made to think differently about a neighbor they haven't had to consider before. And success for us is people knowing that there's a landing place for them, where they'll be welcome, and where we take welcome really seriously and we take neighboring really seriously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think all of our communities could use something like that. Well, Scarry, thank you so much again for making time for our program.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
That is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. Outrage Overload is a Connors Institute podcast. The Connors Institute for Nonpartisan Research and Civic Engagement at Shippensburg University works to disseminate high-quality, nonpartisan information to the American public around issues of societal well-being, democracy promotion, and news literacy. If you found this episode valuable, please share it or leave a review. It really helps. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.